So the slide that I have up now is one of the works of art made by Josiah Wedgwood. This is called the anti-slavery, medallion. This is a plate. It appeared on different forms, but I wanted to kind of move from all the things that were happening in the early 18th century, including the cult of sensibility, to the efforts at reform, which fueled the activist spirit of the later 18th century evangelicals. Now, I do want to be transparent and clarify, this was in my introduction, my area of expertise is British literature, so I do study a little bit of American as it pertains, so I'm not super strong on the American stuff, but in England, in the second half and toward the end of the 18th century, arose a group of very activist evangelicals who were members of the Anglican Church and some outside. But the name you might be most familiar with is William Wilberforce, who was the parliamentarian who led the campaign to abolish the slave trade in England. It took decades for this to succeed, but he and his co-belligerents did succeed in doing this through parliamentary measures, but also through artistic measures. So while Wilberforce would write the laws and make the arguments in front of Parliament, artists like Josiah Wedgwood would make this artwork that, and if you can read this, it says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" An appeal to the basic humanity of British citizens about the humanity of the enslaved people. A figure that is very important to me and the object of study for me for many years is Wilberforce's friend Hannah More, who as a woman was not able to hold office or go to university or do any of those things, but she was a writer, and she wrote poetry and tracts and treatises against slavery and in favor of other kinds of reforms. And so she also was an evangelical who had an activist spirit and helped to bring about great reforms in England, including the abolition of the slave trade. So that's one area where we see evangelicals, again, not a lot of high art, but it is art that was influential and effective and is actually coming back into appreciation in the academy today. And I mentioned before when we were talking about Bunyan, his influence on the rise of the English novel, which was also happening in the 18th century. Now, evangelicals didn't write a lot of novels in any period, but they were hugely influential. In fact, the person who's called the father of the English novel, his name is Samuel Richardson. He wrote a novel called Pamela. I'll talk about that I don't know. I could go on all night about that, so I won't. And then a novel called Clarissa, and he actually is credited with inventing the novel for a number of reasons. And he was what was called then a Methodist, a small m Methodist, because Methodism, this is a part of the evangelical history, the greatest pioneers of the evangelical movement in the early 18th century included John Wesley and John Wesley the preacher, the itinerant preacher who founded the Methodist Church, and his brother Charles Wesley, who wrote like more hymns than is humanly possible, and then George Whitefield. So there's sort of two different branches of evangelicalism. And so the Methodists, which was a term of insult used by people who were members of the Church of England, the Methodists were considered kind of low church, among other things. But Samuel Richardson wrote the first novel, which was mocked and derided and disdained because it was a work of literature that wasn't written, wasn't in poetry, it was written in common, even coarse language, because the subject was a young servant girl. And so this is probably the first sort of truly evangelical footprint in the artistic world, and it was art that was really more or less for the people. And the classically trained writers who knew Hebrew and Greek, unlike Samuel Richardson, mocked and ridiculed work like that. And I mean, I think we see this going on today within evangelicalism and politics, this idea of the elite versus the common people, and it goes back really that far. I already mentioned Jane Austen and Sense and Sensibility and then all of her other novels. Now, Austen was not an evangelical. She was the daughter of an Anglican clergyman and very devout in her Anglican faith, even wrote her own prayers and observed a regular devout liturgical life. But she did write two things about evangelicals in her personal correspondence. The first thing that she wrote was that she doesn't like the evangelicals. But then later she wrote that, and I'm just roughly paraphrasing here, that she probably should become evangelical, and evangelicals probably are the happiest people because they kind of know the truth the best, or something like that. So just to kind of give you a picture of how people were engaging with evangelicalism, and also because these novels, Richardson's novel Pamela is considered what's called a sentimental novel, and that again grows out of the cult of sensibility. Charles Dickens, the greatest novelist, arguably one of the greatest novelists of the Victorian age, was not an evangelical. He was a somewhat heterodox Christian, but he was very influenced by evangelicalism and sentimentality. And the same with Uncle Tom's Cabin over here in America, which is also considered a sentimental novel. A lot of people think it's great literature, and it was great literature because it moved people's hearts about the problem of slavery, but it did so by being sentimental, rather than just by sheer force of what's right and wrong. It was like an appeal to hearts and emotions, which worked for a short time. It worked, but that's kind of the argument that I'm creating and building up here, is that sentimentality can be a shortcut to longer lasting, harder truths that really do bring about lasting change. Okay, let's see, I think I had another. Okay, yes, so I'll talk a little bit more about this painting in a moment, but I want to talk about aesthetics, because we were talking about sensibility and sensitivity and sentimentality, and the word aesthetics arose in the 18th century, and it has a long history. It involves Immanuel Kant and philosophy, and it involves the study of our perception of beauty and so forth. And then later in the 19th century, there's a whole movement called aestheticism, which is art for art's sake. So there's a lot that's interesting there. But what I want to focus in on is that the word aesthetics, which is, the word in its basic definition is that it's something pertaining to beauty, right? Something pertaining to beauty. And we tend, because we're visual creatures primarily, my dogs are like nose creatures primarily, but because we're visual creatures primarily, we often think of our key sense as our sense of sight, and so we might talk about the aesthetics of a room. I think these aesthetics are pretty good. They're like very modern in the best sense, but well done, people. And rooms and architecture and buildings and people have all kinds of different aesthetics that we can perceive through the senses. But aesthetics more technically refers to any of our senses. So if you think of having anesthesia before you have surgery, which is a good thing, that word literally means like so that dulling your senses so you cannot feel things. So aesthetics really, at its core, means any kind of bodily response to stimuli. So we think of, so we respond to the aesthetics of this room. It's either pleasing or not pleasing, but it applies to all of our senses. So it's helpful to remember that we may not be aware of it. It's usually very precognitive, and we may not even sense it. But when we have an aesthetic response to something, it means we're having a bodily response. So like maybe the aesthetics of the room make us calm, Or if we go home and things are cluttered, it makes us not calm, right? Or we hear a sound and it's soothing, or we hear a sound and it's jarring. Sometimes we're aware of these bodily responses to aesthetic experience, but oftentimes we're really not even that aware of it because it's such a low register, or we're not paying attention. So aesthetics is really the word when we talk about beauty, and I want to begin to orient our attention toward that, because that's a much more transcendent understanding than something that just simply causes an emotion, causes us to weep at the stage, what's performed on the stage, and then ignore our suffering servant outside, or the Hallmark commercial that makes us cry for no reason, or the Budweiser commercial during the Super Bowl with the puppies and the draft horses, and we get so annoyed. Why am I crying at this commercial? Well, because it's they know how to trigger the response. That's sort of sentimental response is not the same thing as what beauty does in causing an aesthetic response for us. So just to draw a little bit of a biblical connection to beauty, the Greek word kalan, and I don't know Greek, I just did the research here, but someone can correct me, but it refers to an ideal of beauty that is manifested both morally and physically. It sometimes gets translated into the word good. Right, so it might be we just say throughout the Bible, in both the New Testament and the obviously the Old Testament isn't written in Greek, but there are parallels in the creation narrative in Genesis. Like when God says it is good, He actually means it is good morally and good aesthetically. Like His creation is beautiful and it's also morally good. In the New Testament, in Matthew 12:33, which says, "Make a tree good, and its fruit will be good," that's the word that's used there. It's good in every way. Good, beautifully. It's beautiful. It's healthy. It's good for us. And so the word suggests all the senses of beauty that are good for our body, good for our eyes, and so forth. So the link between aesthetic sensibility, which is feeling the right emotional response arise from sensory perception, and moral sense, which is making the right moral judgments, is something, I was kind of making fun of the cult of sensibility, but if we think about it in a different way, if we understand the beauty and the aesthetic and our right bodily and moral response and judgments to what we see and hear, that's the more transcendent understanding of what is beautiful. But often what happens is that we just confuse, to use a linguistic expression here, we confuse the sign of the thing for the thing. Right, so we just see something that triggers a response, and we think that is the thing. So now, what Bunyan was doing is he was using signs or symbols that were the thing, and that's why his work is a masterpiece, because he did it so well. Those symbols do express the transcendent truth of things, for the most part. But when we stop using allegory and symbols so skillfully, that's when we can start to descend from beauty and truth and goodness to mere sentimentality. So, going back to our history of evangelicalism, and I mentioned this before, but so just to bring us sort of up to speed, the evangelical revival begins in the early 18th century, continues growing in influence through the 18th century, really gained the greatest influence in helping to abolish the slave trade. Like that was very important. But also the abolitionists were trying to bring about a number of other reforms. I think I already mentioned that they sought reform in animal welfare. William Wilberforce was one of the founding members of the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, later called the RSPCA, and in America the ASPCA, because they thought that being cruel to animals was bad. go them, right? I mean, this was not considered a liberal agenda at the time. This was just basic Christianity. They sought, Wilberforce and Moore in particular, sought to bring reform to the wealthy because they thought the wealthy should set an example for everyone else. Hannah More opened Sunday schools to teach the poor to read because she wanted them to be able to read the Bible and recite the catechism and learn basic sort of domestic economy so their lives could improve. She was accused of being a revolutionary for that. That was way too radical for a lot of people, but she did this out of her evangelical faith. And so by the time we get to the Victorian age, which is a couple decades into the 19th century, evangelicalism had reached its sort of peak influence, or was still reaching its peak influence. Queen Victoria ascends, and all that we would associate with the Victorian age, I don't know if you associate things with the Victorian age or not. I think about it a lot. But if you associate anything with the Victorian, like this painting is quintessential Victorian. And I've got some other things to show you too. The Victorian age, in its best and its worst qualities, reflected the influence of evangelicalism. So, as Charles Dickens famously said, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? That's what he's saying about the Victorian age, and I think that we can see how evangelicals kind of reflected the best and worst about themselves. So one of the things that happens in evangelical and Victorian art is sort of what Bunyan was doing, is there's this element of didacticism, so that art's purpose is to teach. And now this is, there are lots of discussions around the purpose of art and what is art and all of these things, and that would be another set of 3 or 9 lectures. But something that's didactic has as its main purpose teaching a lesson. And Victorians were really into teaching lessons through their art. Or later, like Oscar Wilde, they're really into not teaching lessons through their art, or pretending they weren't teaching lessons through their art, but they really were. Oscar Wilde. Okay, but anyway. The most didactic novel I've ever read is A Picture of Dorian Gray by someone who claims not to be didactic, but that's another story. So this famous Victorian painting called The Awakening, whoops, I knew I was going to do that. We good? We're good? Okay. The Awakening Conscience. I don't know how, I guess you can see that pretty well. It's really the story, I'll give you the short version. It's a beautiful painting. Obviously, the person who painted this has a lot of skill. I could never do anything like this. But what it is it's a painting, and all of the cues are there. All the symbols are there if you know how to read a painting and know what they mean, and other people have done that. This is a fallen woman, a kept woman, a mistress, who is having a moment of her conscience awakening, and she is rising up out of the lap of her keeper. I don't know what you call that. And he's going, what's going on? He's got a kind of a smirk on his face. He's not had the awakening. We know she's a mistress because there are no rings, and she's in her mourning gown, and there are other symbols all along. So she is leaving this life of sin. She's in this moment where she's going to leave, and he still doesn't have a clue. He thinks it's funny or whatever. And so this is a beautiful painting, but it tells a story. It tells a story of a person having about with their conscience and awakening and having a conversion, essentially, right? An evangelical kind of moment. And so this is a painting that is an example of a didactic work of art that's supposed to tell us a story, to teach us a lesson about how to be awakened and revived and converted. And the Victorian era is filled with artwork like this. This genre of painting is called a narrative painting. So a lot of paintings that are sort of telling a story as opposed to just being a bowl of fruit, which is another way, fulfilling another purpose of art. Is it just supposed to represent, reflect, be, or is it supposed to tell or show or teach us something? Again, that's a discussion that could go on for a long time. So we have this element of didacticism that is prominent and popular in the Victorian age and among evangelicals. And then along came a while ago the Industrial Revolution. That happened a little while ago. But with the development of the Industrial Revolution and all of these, this didactic art and the growing influence of evangelicalism, we can get mass production of things, right? So that is one other thing that happened. Oh, before I get to that, I have to show you another picture. If you think about the Victorian age, surely, whoops, you think, oh, wait, I got everything out of it. I tried so hard. Wait a minute, we got to get back. You think of, right, a Victorian house. I could have added another picture, but already I'm really struggling, you can tell. But if you think of the interior of a Victorian house, it's like got velvet and couches and pooling drapery and ornate piano legs. And another urban myth is like that if you had a piano in the house, you put a skirt around it because you didn't want the legs to show. I don't think it's true, but it's a good stereotype. But all of this Victorian decor and aesthetics, to use that word again, was the fruit of a few different things. One is mass production, the ability to mass produce things, you already saw a sneak peek of one of the things that got mass produced, but also an improved economic state of affairs. More people could make more money and enjoy a higher quality of life. And so how do you display or express your quality of life? But by building an ornate home and decorating it, keeping the wife home so she can decorate it. And that is when the notion of separate spheres for men and women developed and arose. And there's literally a poem written in the middle of the 18th century, which I write about in my book, called The Angel of the House. And that's what she's supposed to do, is be the angel of the house. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But it became the standard, it became the norm, and also a woman being in the house, putting up lots of decorations, became a status symbol for the man, because he could show the world that he was making enough and successful enough that his wife didn't have to work, even though just, decades before, most men and women were working together in cottage industries or working together. She would often keep the books in the home. They were working together. So this was a kind of a new development of opulence and display of wealth. And so the whole cult of domesticity and the cult of womanhood developed. I get into all that in my book. That's not my point here, but I wanted to show you how the art goes along with that. So if a woman could stay in the home as a symbol of a man's financial success, then all the more time to decorate, I guess, is the short story. Okay. So visual culture developed alongside this, increased standard of living, mass production made possible by the Industrial Revolution, and the leisure time that increased so that there was more time to do these things, and with that, with this rise of visual culture, the way in which things and material objects could reflect one's economic status or one's religious beliefs. There's no better way to show you are a sincere Christian than to put the bumper sticker on your car, right? Well, that started a long time ago. So another way that became really cool to show your Christian belief, was this guy. Oh, this is the head of Christ, a very famous painting made by Walter Salmon in 1940. If you know it because it was one of the most, it's probably the most reproduced image of Jesus that was ever made in the world, because it not only got painted and reproduced as a print, but it got put on lamps. I have a clock at home I bought on eBay that has the face on there. This is a long story. It's still in the box, but it got put on all kinds of things. It ended up being put on little cards that would go with young men when they went off into World War II, like little prayer cards, and so it became very, very familiar to people. Now, there are entire books written on this painting, and I won't go into that, but suffice it to say that this particular image of Jesus does a lot of things. It does uphold a certain cultural picture of Jesus that probably doesn't match up with the little biblical text that we have. It also, interestingly enough, I found out in my research, because I wouldn't have thought of it, the posture is very similar to what a lot of Hollywood celebrities of the age, their pictures would be like this, right? These profile pictures, and then yearbook pictures would be modeled on that. So there's just so many messages and values and ideas and ideals mixed into this one simple picture, which becomes embedded in our brains and forms our imaginations and gives us expectations that we might not even really think about until we're confronted with them. So this is just an example of what visual culture does, and how aesthetic experience teaches us and primes us to think and see the world in certain ways. And so we've gone really from seeing the evangelical revival as being one that is centered on the word and on the text, and one that perhaps is suspicious of, at the very least, of imagination and art and images. And yet at the same time, by the time we get to the end of the Victorian age and into the early 20th century, a lot of other factors that are going on in the culture have produced a kind of visual culture in which the signs become mistaken for the things. And so you can just, stake your claim as a Christian family by hanging this print on your wall or some other thing that's mass produced. And we all do it. Please don't go home and tear down your whatever, but or disrespect your great aunt for having this painting up. That's not the point. I'm just trying to give the history. So we've talked about sentimental art. I don't know if we've talked about it enough, but so sentimental art, whether it's a commercial or a novel by Charles Dickens, or a painting or print like this, is keying into kind of our emotions, oftentimes our preconceptions and our biases, or the things that we already believe in, and rather than being transcendent in the way that beauty is, the way that beauty calls us, the way that beauty is both morally good and aesthetically good, and doesn't just leave us in the place that we were or reinforce our already existing biases and assumptions. That's not what beauty does. We'll get to some beauty later. But before we go forward and think about how good and wonderful real beauty is, I want to go a little bit backwards and talk about something that's sort of the extreme example of sentimental art, and that is kitsch. Okay? Kitsch. I mean, you go on the internet and search kitsch and you'll find all kinds of examples. This was like the one that I found. So kitsch comes from a German word that means trash. And some of you may know the word, you may not. Whenever I introduce the word, I'll often hear later, that's the thing that my students will remember most about the class or whatever is the word kitsch, because we are surrounded by kitsch, and it's okay to love our kitsch. But it's also important to know that it's kitsch, right? So kitsch would be, it's just basically anything that's cheap, it's imitation, it's a replica. If you go on vacation, you get a little ornament or something. It might be kitsch, but it's just a reminder. You can't go back to Italy again, So you get the little souvenir to remind you. It's just a cheap version of the experience. It's perfectly fine, but it's also helpful to know what kitsch is. So the most famous sort of explanation of kitsch comes from Milan Kundera in his novel The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which also was made into a film. And he defines kitsch, which again is just sort of cheap, sentimental art that's mass-produced. Anyway, I won't give examples, okay? But Kundera says This is his critique of it. Kitsch causes two tears to flow in succession. The first tear says, "How nice to see children running on the grass." The second tear says, "How nice to be moved together with all mankind by children running on the grass." So there's the authentic emotional response, which would be an aesthetic experience. But then there's the one like, "Oh, look how good I am. Oh, look," that's very self-conscious and aware, and that's when it becomes kitsch. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm gonna close with this section with Flannery O'Connor, the great Catholic writer, 20th century American writer, who memorably compares the sentimentality of kitsch or any cheap art to pornography. She says that both sentimentality and pornography sever the experience, whether an emotional experience or a sexual one, from its meaning and purpose. Sentimentality separates the emotions that we feel from the purpose of emotions, just as pornography separates the sexual experience from its true meaning and purpose. So, let's put that in our hats and take a break.